This video is part of a larger series entitled Books That Stick in My Brain, and this particular sub-series in the larger series, Books That Stick in My Brain, is about John Frame's book, Doctrine of the Knowledge of God. I think one of the characteristic sections of Doctrine of the Knowledge of God is Frame's discussion of two issues in theological epistemology, theological understanding of knowing. Two issues that have come up in the context of and in the aftermath of the work of Cornelius Van Til, who was Frame's teacher and inspiration and was a longtime apologist and philosopher at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. One of the issues is the question about the knowledge of the unbeliever. Can the unbeliever know anything at all? And there are places in Cornelius Van Til's work where it sounds like the answer is no, as there are places in the Bible which sounds like the answer is no. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. There is no understanding. They all become corrupt. You look at Romans 1, God has revealed himself in everything, and yet sinners suppress the knowledge of God and their hearts are darkened and they become fools. So it looks like there are places in the Bible that teach that unbelievers can know nothing, specifically nothing of God. But really, if you don't know God, you don't know anything properly. So if you're darkened in relation to God, then you're confused about everything. So the things in the Bible that lead us to think, unbelievers can't really know anything. But on the other hand, there's the common experience everyone has had, recognizing that unbelievers, atheists, people who are, personally wicked people, know a lot of stuff. They understand a lot of stuff. And there are people who are not particularly good people and are unbelievers who know a lot about the Bible and can accurately describe what the Bible teaches and what Christian theology teaches about God. So how do you put those two things together? Frame, I think, does a fantastic job, as he does in so many issues, of breaking it down and trying to clarify what questions are actually at stake. One of his inspirations is Ludwig Wittgenstein, and one of Wittgenstein's characteristic methodological moves is to use ordinary language in philosophy rather than jargon-filled language. And Frame is doing that in theology. He tries to break down, specifically ask, what are the questions being asked? What does this mean? Trying to clarify specifically what's being said. And so from that, he comes up with a really nuanced description of the believer's kind of divided epistemology. On the one hand, the believer does know God. God is inescapable. That's what Romans 1 says. And it's not just that he knows about God, but he's confronted with the presence of the covenant Lord, and he can't get away from it. So every human being that has ever existed has a personal relationship with God. Sometimes, frequently, that's a personal relationship of enmity. The person doesn't love God, the person hates God, and God considers the person an enemy. So there's a relationship of hostility, but it's still an interpersonal relationship, and that's inescapable. And yet, unbelievers don't know anything, God or anything else, as they ought to know, for the reasons I've already stated, that in order to know anything properly, we have to know it in its relation to God as a creation of God. We have to know that every situation is orchestrated by the living God, the Lord who controls all things. We have to take account of his authority. If we don't take account of the authority of the Word of God, then we're not really knowing things as we ought to know. And then Frame gives a really interesting list of the variety of ways that people suppress the truth. Sometimes we read that in Romans 1, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And we think it means that people just overtly deny what they actually know. But there are all kinds of ways to deflect what we know. Frame points to the example of the Pharisees, who know a lot of things, who say a lot of the right things, and yet don't know as they ought to know, and in one sense are profoundly ignorant, because their knowledge doesn't involve obedience to the will of God, doesn't involve obedience to Torah. So that's one issue, one epistemological issue that Frame covers that I think is characteristic because of the way he goes through the issue and breaks it down and tries to clarify what questions are at stake. The other issue that comes up in Doctrine of the Knowledge of God, one other issue that I think is characteristic and illustrative, is the question of the relation between God's knowledge and man's knowledge. This was a huge debate between Cornelius Van Til on the one hand and Gordon Clark, a Reformed philosopher, on the other. And Gordon Clark would say things like, God and human beings know, when they know a rose, a flower, they know the exact same rose in the exact same way. And Van Til would say, that can't possibly be right, because God's knowledge and human knowledge are different. And they just go at it, and they have this roaring fight about whether human beings know as God knows and whether their knowledge has the same content. And Frame kind of, tries to separate out the issues. What's actually going on here? One of the things he tries to do is try to isolate the motivations behind each of the contestants. What is Clark concerned about? What is he worried about? He's worried about skepticism. He believes that true human knowledge is thinking God's thoughts after him. And if there's no relationship between human knowledge and divine knowledge, if they're not connected at all, which sometimes that's the way Van Til sounds, if they're not connected at all, then we can't know anything. Well, what is motivating Van Til? Van Til is motivated by wanting to affirm the epistemological significance, the significance for knowing of the creator-creature distinction. That you don't collapse that so that God's knowledge and our knowledge is ever identical. And again, Frame breaks it down and is able to sort through that. He affirms the right motivation of each party. Clark is right to be concerned about skepticism. Van Til is right to assert the creator-creature distinction. And he breaks it down and clarifies what's actually going on and comes to a position that I think is a stronger, more solid, clearer than either of the two contestants. One that avoids the skepticism that Clark is worried about, but also preserves the creator-creature distinction that Van Til is worried about. Again, that's an example of that's the way of doing theology that I think Frame exemplifies so well. A charitable, clear-sighted, biblically grounded way of thinking through issues, rather than it'd be easier for Frame, being a disciple of Van Til, just to take sides in the battle. I'm Team Van Til, and therefore I hate Gordon Clark. Instead, he looks at both, tries to understand the motivation of both, and tries to work carefully through what the issues actually are. Frame is a model theologian for every tradition, especially the Reformed tradition, in that regard.